September 17, 1940. Enfield, North London. The Royal Small Arms Factory hummed with precision, a mechanical heartbeat beneath the shadow of German bombers that had, just 3 nights prior, reduced half the East End to rubble and ash. Inside workshop number 7, women in coveralls assembled what American observers had mockingly called an overcomplicated tea kettle with a trigger, the Bren light machine gun. Major Frank Wilson of the U.S. Army Ordnance Department stood beside the production line, notebook in hand, watching British hands move with practiced efficiency across steel components that gleamed under factory lights. He had arrived with certainty. American weapons were superior, simpler, more pragmatic. The British, with their insistence on tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, their curved magazines, their meticulously machined parts, they were manufacturing museum pieces while modern war demanded mass production and expendability. But something nagged at him as he watched a 52-year-old woman named Elizabeth Thornton assemble her 14th Bren of the morning, her movements economical and certain, her eyes containing something Wilson would only later recognize as quiet knowledge, that what seems complex to the arrogant is merely precise to those who understand. The American military establishment of the late 1930s approached European weaponry with the confidence of a nation that had, they believed, perfected the industrial philosophy of warfare. When British representatives demonstrated the Bren gun to U.S. ordnance officials in 1937, the reception was polite, but dismissive. The weapon, adapted from the Czechoslovakian ZB Verziern 26 and manufactured under license in Britain, embodied everything American military doctrine considered excessive. It featured 30 distinct components requiring precision machining, a curved 30-round magazine that looked impractical, a chrome-lined barrel that seemed unnecessarily expensive, and a gas system with an adjustable regulator, a refinement American designers viewed as over-engineering. The Browning automatic rifle, by contrast, represented American pragmatism, straightforward, powerful, producible in quantities that could overwhelm any enemy through sheer volume of fire and industrial capacity. Colonel James Harrison, speaking to the Army War College in 1938, articulated the prevailing wisdom. The British gun is a marvel of peacetime engineering, but war doesn't wait for gunsmiths to measure tolerances. War demands weapons you can make by the thousands, maintain with a screwdriver and replace when they fail. His audience nodded. It made perfect sense. America had won the Great War not through precision but through overwhelming material superiority, arriving late but arriving with such industrial force that German resistance collapsed beneath American steel, American wheat, American bodies fresh and numerous. The philosophy was clear: acceptable accuracy, maximum production, numerical dominance. What American observers failed to grasp, or perhaps refused to acknowledge, was that British military thinking had been forged in different fires. Britain had fought the entirety of the Great War, not just its final year. British soldiers had lived in trenches where weapons caked with mud needed to function or men died. They had fought in deserts where sand infiltrated every mechanism, in jungles where humidity corroded metal overnight, in Arctic cold where lesser weapons froze solid. British arsenals didn't over-engineer weapons, they engineered them for reality. The Bren's complexity wasn't excess, it was survival distilled into steel. Its chrome-lined barrel wasn't luxury. It was the difference between a weapon that fired its 10,000th round as accurately as its first, and one that became a metal club after 3,000. But in 1938, with war still theoretical for Americans, such distinctions seemed academic, even quaint, British eccentricity rather than British wisdom. The certainty began to crack in the winter of 1940, though few Americans recognized it yet. Lieutenant Robert Hawkins, attached to the British Expeditionary Force as an observer during the Norway campaign, filed a report that his superiors initially classified as anomalous field data requiring verification. Hawkins had watched British troops fighting German mountain infantry in conditions that reduced warfare to its most elemental brutality: temperatures far below zero, snow that turned battlefields into white hell, combat at ranges where you could see the frost in your enemy's beard before you killed him. The Bren guns, Hawkins reported, functioned flawlessly. Men fired them until the barrels glowed red in the Arctic darkness, changed barrels with frost-numbed fingers, and continued firing. German MG-34s, sophisticated, feared weapons, jammed when snow infiltrated their mechanisms. British Brens, simpler in conception but more refined in execution, kept firing. The report troubled Hawkins not because it contradicted American doctrine, but because of what he had witnessed in the faces of British gunners. There was no surprise, no relief, only expectation confirmed. They trusted their weapons with a certainty that went beyond training, beyond faith. It was knowledge earned in blood. When Hawkins asked a corporal named Davies why he wasn't concerned about his Bren jamming, Davies had looked at him with something approaching pity. "Jamming, sir? Bren doesn't jam. Feed it right, keep the gas port clear, and it'll fire until you run out of Germans or ammunition, whichever comes first." He spoke with the casual certainty of a man describing sunrise. Back in Washington, Hawkins's report circulated through the Ordnance Department, generating mild interest and considerable skepticism. Norway was an aberration, analysts concluded. Extreme conditions, small unit actions, insufficient sample size to draw meaningful conclusions. The bar remained America's designated squad automatic weapon, and production contracts were already signed. Moreover, there was the psychological dimension no one openly discussed. Accepting that British weapons might be superior required, acknowledging that American industrial philosophy, the very foundation of national military confidence, might be flawed. It was easier to dismiss one lieutenant's observations than to question an entire system of belief, so they filed the report, noted the data, and continued with their certainty intact. Reality, however, was preparing a more comprehensive lesson. June 1942, North Africa. The desert proved to be the great revealer of engineering truth. Captain Michael Chen, U.S. Army liaison to the British 8th Army, found himself in positions where American and British units fought side by side against Rommel's Africa Corps, and the differences in weaponry became impossible to ignore. The desert was a weapons testing ground more brutal than any laboratory. Sand that infiltrated every mechanism, heat that expanded metal beyond designed tolerances, cold nights that contracted components, and combat intensity that revealed every design flaw within days rather than years. The Browning automatic rifles began to fail, not catastrophically, not all at once, but consistently enough that American squad tactics started adapting around weapon unreliability rather than enemy capability. Sand infiltrated the bar's complex action. The weapon's bottom-loading magazine, designed for prone shooting, collected sand with every position change. Heat affected the weapon's headspace, causing malfunctions. Most significantly, the bar's fixed barrel meant that sustained firing, the very purpose of a squad automatic weapon, turned the gun into an overheated liability. Soldiers learned to fire in short bursts, to give weapons time to cool, to carry extra bars because one would inevitably be inoperable during sustained combat. The Bren guns, meanwhile, performed as if the desert were their natural habitat. The top-mounted curved magazine kept ammunition above the sand. The chrome-lined barrel dissipated heat more effectively and maintained accuracy through extended firefights. The quick-change barrel system meant that when one barrel grew too hot, the gunner simply swapped it, a 15-second procedure that British soldiers could perform by touch in complete darkness. Most remarkably, the Bren's gas system, with its adjustable regulator, allowed gunners to compensate for sand infiltration or extreme temperatures by simply turning a dial, maintaining reliable function in conditions that would render other weapons useless. Chen watched a British sergeant named Patterson clean his Bren after a 6-hour engagement near El Alamein. The process took 12 minutes. The sergeant disassembled 17 components, wiped them clean, reassembled the weapon, test-fired 3 rounds, and returned to his position. The weapon had fired approximately 2,000 rounds that day. Patterson showed no concern that it wouldn't fire 2,000 more the next day. Chen thought of his own unit, where weapon maintenance was a constant preoccupation, where soldiers hoarded working bars, where firefights were planned around weapon reliability rather than tactical advantage. Something fundamental was wrong, but admitting it meant confronting American exceptionalism itself. The psychological impact rippled through American units faster than official reports traveled through military bureaucracy. Soldiers talked. They compared notes with British allies, traded stories, observed combat results. A mythology began developing around the Bren, stories that mixed fact with battlefield folklore but pointed toward undeniable truth. There was the account of a Bren that had been submerged in a canal during the fighting in Tunisia, retrieved 3 days later, fired without cleaning, and functioned perfectly. the story of a British gunner who had fired 6,000 rounds through a single Bren in one day during the Battle of Mareth Line, changing barrels 4 times, and never experiencing a single malfunction. These stories circulated through American ranks with the power of religious testimony, soldiers bearing witness to engineering excellence that contradicted everything their training had taught them about weapons and warfare. The response among American military leadership was complex, revealing deeper tensions in how America understood itself and its capabilities. Junior officers like Chen filed detailed reports praising Bren performance and recommending immediate procurement for American forces. Mid-level commanders acknowledged the data, but emphasized logistical complications, different caliber ammunition, training requirements, supply chain disruption. Senior leadership remained largely silent, their inaction speaking volumes. To admit British weapons were superior wasn't merely a technical acknowledgement. It challenged fundamental assumptions about American industrial and technological supremacy. Colonel Harrison, the same officer who had dismissed the Bren in 1938, now found himself writing classified memoranda that struggled to reconcile ideology with reality. His reports employed elaborate linguistic gymnastics. The Bren was suitable for certain specialized conditions. It performed adequately in limited contexts. It showed interesting design features that might inform future American development. He never wrote what the data clearly demonstrated, that British weapons engineers had created a superior light machine gun, that American overconfidence had blinded military planners to engineering excellence, that precision manufacturing might matter more than production volume. What troubled thoughtful officers most wasn't the weapon comparison itself, but what it revealed about American military culture. The same confidence that made American soldiers formidable, their belief in technological superiority, their faith in American exceptionalism, also made them vulnerable to dismissing genuine excellence when it emerged from allies they unconsciously patronized. The British had been fighting since 1939. They had learned lessons paid for in blood. Perhaps some officers began to think privately, America should listen to teachers rather than assuming itself the eternal instructor. Behind the combat zones, a quieter drama unfolded in procurement offices and congressional committees. Captain Sarah Mitchell, a logistics officer assigned to Allied materiel assessment, assembled data that would eventually reach President Roosevelt's desk, though only after passing through multiple levels of bureaucratic resistance. Her analysis was devastating in its simplicity. Weapon reliability statistics, maintenance hour comparisons, accuracy measurements, barrel life expectancy, and most damningly, casualty rates correlated with weapon types. American units equipped with bars suffered higher casualties in sustained firefights than comparable British units with Brens, not because American soldiers were less capable, but because their weapons failed at critical moments. Mitchell's report triggered fierce institutional resistance. The Ordnance Department, which had championed the BR, responded with counter-arguments that revealed how deeply pride had infiltrated professional judgment. They emphasized that American weapons were designed for American tactics, that the BR's shortcomings were overstated, that combat conditions in 1942-43 weren't representative of future warfare. They pointed to production numbers. America was manufacturing weapons at rates that dwarfed British output. Quantity, they insisted, remained its own quality. If bars required more maintenance and had shorter functional lifespans, American industry would simply produce more of them. The argument possessed a certain logical coherence, until one remembered that each failed weapon in combat meant dead soldiers, and no production rate could compensate for that. The British, for their part, observed this American internal debate with characteristic restraint. They offered to supply Bren guns to American forces, to share manufacturing specifications, to train American gunsmiths in Bren maintenance. The offers were politely declined. American pride wouldn't permit equipping soldiers with foreign weapons, especially not British weapons, given the complex post-war positioning both nations were already contemplating. Britain, exhausted and nearly bankrupt, was losing its empire. America was ascending. To adopt British weapons felt, to some decision-makers, like acknowledging a hierarchy that history was inverting. What none of these bureaucratic considerations changed was the reality unfolding in Europe and the Pacific. American soldiers continued fighting with weapons they had learned to distrust, while British soldiers fought with weapons they knew would function when death came calling. And soldiers, unlike bureaucrats, measured weapons not in production statistics or national pride, but in the much simpler metric of whether pulling the trigger resulted in the enemy dying, rather than themselves. By that measure, the Bren was winning, and everyone in combat knew it. D-Day and the Normandy campaign brought the weapon debate out of theoretical discussion and into immediate, undeniable crisis. Lieutenant James O'Connor, leading a rifle platoon onto Omaha Beach, watched his unit's 3 bars fail within the first hour of combat. One from sand infiltration, one from a bent feed mechanism after a rough landing, one from overheating after just 200 rounds fired in rapid succession. His platoon's firepower was reduced to individual rifles at precisely the moment sustained automatic fire meant the difference between suppressing German positions and dying in the surf. 30 yards away, a British commando unit advanced with Brens that fired continuously, providing covering fire that allowed both British and American units to move off the beach. O'Connor would write in his after-action report, with unusual bluntness for military documentation, "We were saved by British weapons while ours failed. This is unacceptable." The bocage country of Normandy proved even more revealing. The hedgerow fighting required precisely the kind of sustained, reliable automatic fire at close range that exposed every weapon's true character. German MG-42s dominated with their terrifying rate of fire, but they required 2-man teams, extensive ammunition supply, and fixed positions to be effective. American bars, designed for mobile warfare, struggled with the sustained firefights that hedgerow combat demanded. The Bren, however, seemed purpose-built for this nightmare landscape. Light enough for one man to carry and employ independently, accurate enough to engage targets at hedgerow ranges, reliable enough to fire through engagements that lasted hours, and with a barrel change system that meant the weapon never overheated beyond function. American soldiers began acquiring Bren guns, a euphemism for taking them from British units through trades, finding them on battlefields, or simply taking them when opportunity arose. This unauthorized equipment substitution created supply nightmares for logistics officers, but revealed soldier-level wisdom that transcended official procurement doctrine. Men trusted their lives to weapons that functioned, regardless of what flag was stamped on the manufacturer's mark. By August 1944, some American units had more Brens than bars, creating an awkward situation where official weapons allocations bore no relationship to actual combat reality. The response from command was predictable. Orders to return British weapons, reminders about proper equipment use, threats of disciplinary action. But combat commanders, caught between regulations and reality, largely ignored these directives. Their calculus was simple. Soldiers with reliable weapons lived longer and fought more effectively. Every other consideration was secondary. The institutional fiction that American weapons were adequate continued at higher headquarters. The combat truth that British weapons were superior continued in the hedgerows. The breaking point came in September 1944, during Operation Market Garden. Major General Matthew Ridgway, commanding the 82nd Airborne Division, filed a report that could not be ignored, dismissed, or bureaucratically buried because of his rank, his reputation, and the unambiguous clarity of his language. His paratroopers had jumped into Holland with bars. Within 3 days of sustained combat, 40% of those bars had malfunctioned. Ridgway's report didn't employ diplomatic language or technical euphemisms. Our squad automatic weapons are inadequate for sustained combat operations. British Bren guns, by contrast, functioned reliably throughout the engagement. I formally request authorization to equip American airborne forces with Bren light machine guns. A 2-star general publicly requesting foreign weapons to replace American equipment created a crisis that forced action. The Ordnance Department could no longer maintain comfortable fictions. Congressional committees demanded explanations. The Secretary of War convened a special board to assess light machine gun performance. What followed was a remarkable exercise in institutional honesty, rare in military history, where admitting error often destroys careers and undermines public confidence. The board, composed of combat veterans, ordnance experts, and independent engineers, conducted rigorous testing, accuracy trials, endurance tests, environmental exposure, maintenance requirements, and most critically, surveys of soldiers who had used both weapons in combat. The results vindicated everything that combat reports had been saying for 3 years. The Bren was superior in virtually every measurable category: accuracy, reliability, ease of maintenance, barrel life, function in adverse conditions, and soldier confidence, that intangible but crucial factor of whether men trusted their weapons when death approached. The only category where the bar excelled was production cost, but even that advantage evaporated when life cycle costs were calculated. A Bren that functioned for 10,000 rounds without major maintenance was cheaper than a bar that required armorer attention after 3,000 rounds and barrel replacement after 5,000. The board's chairman, Brigadier General Edward Morrison, wrote a conclusion that circulated through military history as an example of institutional humility. American industrial confidence led us to dismiss British engineering excellence as unnecessary complexity. We were wrong. The British designed weapons for war's reality. We designed weapons for war's theory. It is recommended that the United States immediately negotiate licensing for Bren production and begin transitioning squad automatic weapon inventory to Bren or Bren-derived designs. The report landed on desks in October 1944. By then, American soldiers had been fighting with inadequate weapons for 2 years. The political and industrial machinery moved with surprising speed once the decision was made, revealing how much of the previous delay had been pride rather than practical constraint. Within weeks, American negotiators were in Britain finalizing licensing agreements. John Moses Browning's descendants, whose inherited royalties depended on bar production, fought the transition, but they were overruled by military necessity and presidential directive. Roosevelt, informed of the situation by Marshall, cut through the bureaucratic resistance with characteristic directness. Get our soldiers the weapons that work. Sort out the pride and patents after we've won the war. But procurement timelines meant that American-manufactured Brens wouldn't reach frontline units until mid-1945 at earliest. In the interim, a stopgap solution emerged that would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier: direct purchase and immediate distribution of British-manufactured Brens to American forces. Transport aircraft that had been carrying ammunition now carried crates of Bren guns. Supply depots in France established exchange programs, where American units could turn in bars and receive Brens, along with training materials hastily translated from British manuals into American military terminology. Sergeant Marcus Washington, a squad leader in the 3rd Infantry Division, received his Bren in December 1944, during the frozen hell of the Ardennes counteroffensive. His training consisted of 30 minutes with a British armorer who showed him disassembly, cleaning, and barrel changes, then fired 50 rounds to demonstrate the weapon's handling characteristics. Washington, skeptical after years with the BR, expected difficulties. Instead, he discovered something that would reshape his understanding of weapons and warfare. The Bren functioned exactly as promised. In 3 weeks of winter combat, through conditions that included snow, mud, river crossings, and firefights that lasted hours, his Bren never malfunctioned. Not once. He cleaned it when possible, changed barrels when necessary, and otherwise simply fired it whenever Germans appeared. The weapon's reliability became something he stopped thinking about, the highest compliment a soldier can give to equipment. The psychological shift this created was profound. Soldiers who had conserved ammunition because they couldn't trust their weapons to fire when needed now operated with confidence that changed tactical calculations. Squad leaders planned maneuvers assuming automatic weapons would function rather than hoping they would. The change wasn't dramatic or sudden, no battlefield revolution, but rather a quiet recalibration of what soldiers expected from their equipment. They expected competence. They expected reliability. They expected their weapons to be tools rather than liabilities. The Bren delivered all of this, and in delivering it, completed the education that American arrogance had delayed for half a decade. As Germany collapsed in early 1945, American forces pushing into the Reich carried a mixed arsenal that told the story of institutional transformation. Some units still used bars, waiting for replacement weapons to arrive. Others had transitioned to Brens and discovered that combat effectiveness improved measurably, not because soldiers fought differently, but because their weapons functioned consistently. Captain Robert Chen, the same officer who had observed British weapons in North Africa 3 years earlier, now commanded a company equipped entirely with Brens. His after-action reports documented something remarkable. His unit's ammunition expenditure had decreased while their effectiveness had increased. Soldiers fired less because they trusted each round would fire, which meant they aimed more carefully, which meant they hit more frequently. Reliability bred precision. Desperation bred waste. The final battles in Germany provided the ultimate testing ground. combat in urban ruins, through rubble and flooded basements, in cold rain and spring mud, tested weapons in every conceivable adverse condition. The Brens functioned. They fired when dropped in rivers, when caked in concrete dust, when exposed to temperature extremes, when maintained minimally or not at all. They had become so reliable that soldiers stopped regarding them as mechanical devices requiring careful attention and started treating them as simple tools, which was, in fact, the highest achievement of weapons design, creating something so dependable that its reliability became invisible, taken for granted, expected rather than hoped for. British soldiers, observing American forces now carrying Brens, responded with restrained satisfaction. There was no gloating, no "we told you so," just quiet professional recognition. Sergeant Patterson, the British gunner Chen had observed in North Africa, encountered Chen again near the Elbe River in April 1945. They shared a cigarette while Russian artillery rumbled in the distance. Patterson glanced at the Bren slung on Chen's shoulder. "Good weapon, that," he said simply. Chen nodded. "Should have listened to you 3 years ago," he replied. Patterson shrugged. "War teaches all of us eventually. Some lessons just cost more than others." The unspoken subtext was clear. The lesson had cost American lives. How many soldiers had died because their weapons failed at critical moments? The question was unanswerable and unbearable. Military bureaucracy doesn't calculate casualties attributable to equipment inadequacy. Such statistics would be too damning, too clear an indictment of institutional failure. But soldiers knew. Every combat veteran carried memories of moments when weapons failed, when triggers pulled produced clicks instead of shots, when survival depended on luck rather than reliability. Those memories didn't fade, and they informed everything that came after. The Pacific Theater provided the final, definitive proof of the Bren superiority, though the lesson came too late for many who had fought with lesser weapons through years of island warfare. The jungle combat zones of the Philippines, Okinawa, and the anticipated invasion of Japan represented weapon testing conditions even more brutal than the European theater. Humidity that corroded metal overnight, mud that infiltrated every mechanism, saltwater exposure, extreme heat, and combat at ranges where every malfunction meant death. These conditions reduced weapons to their essential nature, and that essential nature was either reliable or lethal to the men who carried them. Major William Foster, whose battalion received Brens in March 1945 during the Luzon campaign, wrote in his personal diary, later published in military journals, about the transformation in his unit's combat effectiveness. "We had fought for 2 years with bars that we cleaned obsessively, protected desperately, and trusted reluctantly. Now we fight with Brens that we treat roughly, maintain minimally, and trust absolutely. The psychological shift is profound. My men move differently, fight differently. They know their weapons will function. That knowledge is worth divisions." The validation was complete, but it came accompanied by profound institutional regret. Analysis conducted after VJ Day calculated that if American forces had adopted the Bren in 1940, when British allies had offered it, the improved combat effectiveness would have shortened the war by measurable intervals. Not months, perhaps, but weeks, certainly. And weeks of war meant thousands of lives. The calculation was necessarily imprecise, but the direction was clear. American pride had a body count. The reckoning with this reality produced different responses across military hierarchy. Junior officers and enlisted men who had lived with the consequences felt vindicated but bitter. Their superiors had prioritized institutional pride over soldier survival. Mid-level officers, caught between awareness and loyalty, remained largely silent. Senior leadership, responsible for the decisions, engaged in the bureaucratic art of avoiding responsibility. Decisions had been made with the best information available at the time, they claimed. Hindsight was unfair. War required difficult choices. No malice was intended. All of which was true and all of which was inadequate. Soldiers had fought with inferior weapons because their leaders couldn't admit that allies might know something America didn't. The lesson transcended weapons. It spoke to how nations perceive themselves, how confidence becomes arrogance, how certainty blinds, and how wisdom sometimes requires the humility to learn from others, rather than the pride of assumed superiority. The post-war American military underwent profound self-examination, and the Bren gun saga became a central case study in military education institutions. At West Point, Fort Benning, and the new Armed Forces Staff College, Officers studied the decision-making failures that had delayed Bren adoption. The case revealed systemic problems, institutional resistance to external innovation, the dangers of peacetime thinking applied to wartime reality, how pride could override data, and most critically, how organizations could mistake complexity for difficulty and precision for over-engineering. The British, emerging from the war victorious but economically devastated, watched American adoption of the Bren with complex emotions. Pride, certainly. Their engineering excellence was finally recognized, but also awareness that this recognition came as British global power waned. America was ascending to superpower status partly through the industrial capacity to manufacture everyone's weapons, including British designs. The licensing fees from Bren production would flow to a British economy desperately needing foreign currency, but the symbolic inversion was clear. Britain designed, America produced. The empire was becoming a workshop for the new hegemon. For individual soldiers, the Bren became something more than a weapon. It became a symbol of hard-won wisdom. Veterans returning home carried Brens when possible, keeping them as personal equipment through regulation skirting arrangements. In VFW halls and American Legion posts, you could find Brens mounted on walls beside photographs of young men who had learned, often too late, that superior equipment mattered more than national pride. These veterans formed an informal caucus within American military culture, advocating for honest assessment of Allied innovations and resistance to the assumption that American weapons must inherently be best. The weapons' influence extended into the Cold War. When America designed the M60 machine gun in the 1950s, British influence was evident throughout. The quick-change barrel, the gas system design, the emphasis on reliability over complexity minimization. American weapons designers had learned from British teachers, though institutional memory conveniently forgot to emphasize this in official histories. The M60's flaws, and it had many, emerged precisely where designers deviated from Bren principles in pursuit of American innovation. Where they followed British wisdom, the weapon excelled. Where they insisted on American improvement, problems emerged. The ultimate irony was that by the 1960s, when new soldiers were issued M60s, few knew the weapon's lineage traced directly to the Bren gun their grandfathers had once dismissed as an overcomplicated British eccentricity. History, it seemed, had a sense of humor about national pride. The lessons endured, even when memory of those lessons faded. The moment of complete institutional reckoning came not during the war but after it. In the classified proceedings of the War Department's Lessons Learned Commission in late 1946, General Marshall, in his final months as Chief of Staff, insisted on unflinching honesty. The Bren gun case was examined not to assign blame but to understand how American military culture had allowed pride to override evidence for years, while soldiers paid the price. The transcripts, declassified decades later, reveal remarkable candor. Colonel Harrison, the same officer who had dismissed the Bren in 1938, testified with devastating self-awareness. We believed American industrial methods were inherently superior. We saw British precision manufacturing as old-world inefficiency. We were comprehensively wrong. The British didn't over-engineer the Bren. They engineered it correctly for warfare's reality. We under-engineered the bar by prioritizing production ease over combat effectiveness. I say this not to excuse my judgment, but to ensure future officers don't repeat our failures. The Commission's findings were unambiguous. Institutional arrogance had delayed adoption of superior equipment, resulting in decreased combat effectiveness and increased casualties. The number of American deaths directly attributable to weapon malfunction was impossible to calculate precisely, but combat action reports suggested hundreds, perhaps thousands, of incidents where bar failures contributed to tactical defeats or individual deaths. Each of these represented a moment where American pride had material consequence measured in blood. But the Commission's final report also identified something more insidious than simple weapon comparison, a cultural tendency to dismiss Allied expertise, to assume American methods were optimal, to interpret complexity as failure rather than sophistication. This tendency, the report argued, posed strategic danger in the emerging Cold War. America would need allies, would need to learn from them, would need to adopt their innovations when superior. The Bren gun affair demonstrated the cost of failing to do so. General Marshall's closing statement became required reading at military academies. We were saved from our pride by soldiers who trusted British weapons more than our assurances. They were right. We were wrong. The measure of military professionalism isn't never making mistakes, it's learning from them. We learned. The question is whether we learned deeply enough to prevent repeating this failure in different form. The room was silent. Everyone present understood. The lesson wasn't about a single weapon. It was about whether America could maintain military excellence while also maintaining the humility to learn from others. The answer remained unwritten. 70 years removed from Normandy's hedgerows and the Ardennes' frozen forests, the Bren gun endures in museums and memory as testament to engineering excellence and institutional humility, learned through hard experience. British weapons designers created something remarkable, a light machine gun so reliable that reliability became its defining characteristic, so well engineered that its complexity disappeared into function. They built a weapon that worked. In war, nothing matters more. The American military's journey from dismissal to adoption revealed deeper truths about national character. The same confidence that made American soldiers formidable, their certainty, their optimism, their belief in American exceptionalism, also created dangerous blind spots. They assumed their weapons were best because they were American, their methods superior because they were modern, their judgment sound because it was confident. Reality taught otherwise. The British had been fighting longer, learning harder, paying tuition in blood for lessons about what worked and what failed. They had earned their expertise. What remained, decades later, was the question that every military organization must answer continuously. Can we learn from others? Or must we learn only from our own failures? The Bren gun saga suggested that America could learn, but slowly, reluctantly, at higher cost than necessary. The soldiers who fought with Brens after years with bars understood something their peacetime commanders had missed. Survival matters more than pride, function more than origin, reality more than assumption. The legacy lives in unexpected places. When modern soldiers clean their weapons, when engineers design new firearms, when military officers assess foreign innovations, the memory of the Bren, however dim, influences their thinking. Reliability isn't luxury, it's necessity. Precision isn't over-engineering, it's respect for soldiers' lives. Allied expertise isn't threat to American excellence, it's resource to be honored and learned from. The British workers at Enfield who manufactured Brens under German bombardment, the soldiers who trusted those weapons when death approached, the officers who finally admitted American alternatives were inadequate. All of them participated in a story about truth overcoming pride. In war's harsh democracy, what works survives. What fails dies, taking men with it. The Bren worked. That simple truth, denied for years and finally acknowledged, contains wisdom that transcends any single conflict. Excellence recognizes no nationality, and the price of refusing to learn from others is always paid by those who can least afford it, the soldiers who fight with whatever weapons their leaders' pride provides.